this convocation to order. And I'm going to start with a lighting the equivalent of a chalice. So welcome to UUMUAC's early spring 2025 convocation on the subject of neo-racism, and in particular, a focus on the book Neo-Racism, From Jim Crow to White Supremacy Culture, which was written by, thank you, Dick, by the Reverend Finley C. Campbell, and then edited by Dick Burkhart and Judith Barasanzi after his passing, so that it could actually get out there into the world of readers. Our convocation is in along the principle of the search for truth and meaning. And we think that our founder, Finley C. Campbell, Reverend Dr. Finley C. Campbell, had a lot of truth and meaning that he wanted to share with the world. And so for that purpose, we are focusing on this topic today. So the way we are going to proceed is we are first going to hear from each of the two co-editors, starting with Dick Burkhart and then following with Judith Barasanzi, after which we will have a period, and I'm hoping that the two of them will, their total speaking time will be roughly a half hour. And then we will go into a period of questions and answers based on their comments and remarks. And after that, we will go into the second half of the convocation, which will involve commentary both by myself and then from Bobby Campbell, who is Finley's widow. And after that, we will have another period of questions and answers. So at this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dick Burkhart. Begin.
You don't want to forget the membership meeting at the end, is that correct?
Yeah, yes, we will have a special membership meeting at the end. I was going to announce that we came to that point.
Separate thing.
Right. So so I helped edit. Actually, I was the primary editor of Finley's book. But before I get into my overview of Finley's book and some of the key points that I took from it, I want to give a little preface on how I met Finley Campbell. Sometimes it's hard for me to talk about him. In any case, it was late June 2017 at the UUA General Assembly in New Orleans. This is only a half year since the first election of Donald Trump. 3 months since Peter Morales had resigned as president of the UUA. As a longtime UU advocate for peace and justice, on the board of UUs for a Just Economic Community for many years, I had great respect for Morales. I was very disturbed by the reports of nasty and obviously false accusations of racism and white supremacy against his administration in the so-called hiring controversy. Then at a plenary session, Finley Campbell stood up. He was a person of integrity. He delivered a protest at against the treatment of his friend Peter Morales. I had heard about Finley before, and I'd seen him at a few GAs, but never talked with him. But he not only persisted when the moderators tried to shut him up, but he invited others to join him to, as he put it, desegregate the New Orleans streetcars. Later that day, I was intrigued. and decided to take up his offer, as I was still trying to figure out what in the hell was going on.
Can you tell me the link to that?
Those who are not speaking are encouraged to
Right.
put themselves on mute.
It turned out that one of the doctrines of what Finley called neo-racism was that little or no progress had been made on racial justice over the last 50 years. His point was that the streetcars had long since been desegregated, and that was real progress. There was something fraudulent about the anti-racism that was being proclaimed by the insurrectionists who created the hiring controversy, Christine Rivera and Aisha Hauser, who later that year conducted the white supremacy teach-ins that many found so insulting. When this campaign spread to the larger society, with other identities tagging along, it came to be called woke ideology or woke identity politics, because it proclaimed alertness to injustice, but did not practice what it preached. That is, the term woke became a pejorative due to its aura of hypocrisy. But Finley had conducted true anti-racist trainings for many years and came to understand the underlying dynamics behind this vicious cancel culture as a new form of racism, or neo-racism. Finley's book explains what he learned over the decades as an active dissident against the UUA racial orthodoxy that took full control in 2017. This, I figured out, finally, was due to white guilt over the election of Trump that was misinterpreted as a racial thing rather than as a response to 40 years of escalating economic inequality, where the white working class had actually fallen further behind and compared to the blacks working class. As it turned out, the UUA orthodoxy actually went back to the mid-1990s, waiting for its moment in history, unknown to me and many others, as censorship and misrepresentation are also doctrines of neo-racism. Now, Finley had never studied postmodern philosophy and critical race theory, so this book is more about the historical manifestations of neo-racism, not its theoretical background as elaborated by the whiteness studies of academia. Now, to get to my short review of Finley's book, in this short and spirited book, Finley Campbell spells out a deep commitment to racial justice over racial ideology, developed through many decades of leadership in African American studies and as a dissident Unitarian Universalist. In fact, Finley's concept of neo-racism is itself a critique of the illiberal doctrines and practices, such as cancel culture, that have come to characterize woke identity politics. This hypocritical woke ideology, such as critical race theory, has now alienated so much of the electorate that fueled the rise of Trump, especially his current bullseye on the Department of Education. Finley's racial justice is, by contrast, is grounded in multiracial unity, like the black and white together integration of the civil rights era, as opposed to the anti-white faction of the Black Power movement led by Stokely Carmichael. But as the idealism of MLK faded and economic inequality escalated, the anti-white blaming and shaming grew with support from many elites. As his own peculiar blend of Christian and Marxist, Finley saw right through this, that it was a divide and conquer tactic to promote racial divisions to distract from the growing class divide. In fact, Finley often talked about the rank and file to emphasize the unity of most workers, seeking justice against the depredation of the ruling class. Finley saw what was happening and concluded that neo-racism, that form of racism that became dominant after the civil rights era, had several key components. The newest and most prominent component that he identified was the determination to recruit and promote promising blacks into joining the power structure through higher education and good jobs. The second component, which we just had alluded to, was to promote cultural differences among racial groups, along with white guilt and shame and black resentment, to maintain racial tensions while impeding multiracial unity. And the third was to promote colonial and imperial guilt, shame, and resentments in ways that maintain first world and third world tensions, obstructing global multi-ethnic community unity. The central problem for neo-racism, as Finley saw, was how to keep whites and blacks from uniting to fight against neoliberal globalization and all the inequality and injustices it causes. The primary tactic was to focus on racism as a psychosocial phenomenon, to be solved by introspection and confessions by the purported oppressor, not by economic solidarity and justice that Finley has championed. Typical slogans in the early days were all whites are racist and no blacks, and racism equals prejudice plus power. Finley noted that Louis Farrakhan led a revival of both anti-Jewish and anti-white racism. This evolved into the doctrine of what more recently has been known as white supremacy culture, a nefarious accusation that even liberal institutions with a strong history working for racial justice are somehow infected by hidden practices and attitudes of white supremacy, even though actual white supremacy is a justly reviled fringe movement in the United States. This has been used to justify the cancel culture in the UUA and outside the UUA. That this cancel culture is reminiscent of certain cults or dogmatic religions, or even of totalitarian and fascist regimes. The fundamental principle of justice, innocent until proven guilty, has been violated intentionally, not just on social media, but by institutions such as the Ministerial Fellowship Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Association. I know personally 2 of the ministers who were disfellowshipped by this committee based on false and slanderous accusations, with no proof required under the kangaroo court-type procedures shamelessly embraced by this committee. The claim that we cannot see this supposed white supremacy in our culture because we are swimming in it is a prime example of the science denialism that is embedded in this premier example of what we might call woke ideology. And as to the science, given the rarity of demonstrated white supremacy in the larger society and the liberal history of the UUA, the scientific method would be to make the statement, white supremacy has no significant presence in the UUA, what we call the null hypothesis, requiring very strong evidence to refute. But the only official attempt to address this question came from the Commission on Institutional Change, which issued a report which explicitly avoided any requirement for evidence, and in fact documented 0 evidence for actual white supremacy. Instead, the COIC report tried to change the meaning of white supremacy in a truly Orwellian and highly unethical fashion, so that any group of predominantly European racial heritage could be accused of white supremacy as a reason for anything that the accuser didn't like, with the accuser acting as judge and jury, interpreting things as they chose. Finley saw clearly how such practices and doctrines disempower effective actions for racial justice by making it difficult for black and white people to work together with mutual respect, each contributing according to the assets they bring to the table. Instead, the UUA promoted trainings under the innocuous banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion that explicitly taught this insidious racial ideology. These included the Crossroads Ministry Consulting Group, which inspired a satirical book, The Anti-Racist Trainings by David Wright, back in around the year 2000. the UUA's own Journey to Wholeness workshops, which were their anti-racist trainings for a couple decades, and also the notorious 2017 white supremacy teach-ins. In fact, Finley lists 16 of the absurdities that were proclaimed by these teach-ins, which gave them a pretty bad reputation among many people I knew. As an outspoken dissident, Finley himself was the target of an action of cancel culture by the UUA a few years back, when he was banned from having a booth in the exhibit hall of the annual General Assembly. Well, what was Finley's crime? Actually, Finley had concluded that racial identity is now secondary to the profits of neoliberal globalization, that our rulers are now a trans-white oligarchy, as he put it. That is replacing, and he saw that replacing old autocracies by new will solve nothing. In fact, one of Finley's most penetrating insights is how the white working class has continued as the biggest target of racism. First, anti-Black racism was created by the bosses in the 17th century to destroy white, Black, and red working class solidarity in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. And Finley talks about this in great detail. And after the Civil War, this racism and white supremacy was continued via segregation for the same reasons, divide and conquer. Now neo-racism is doing the same via woke ideology and practices, expanded globally to replace out-of-date colonial ideologies. The recent surge of deaths of despair is one consequence. Welfare programs attempt to mitigate the despair, but they may help create a new generation of poverty when families are broken up. And now neo-racism has become more about class than race, with the poor and struggling of all cultural origins, often unable to meet the requirements for food, housing, healthcare, or education in the face of torn social safety nets. So Finley concludes that we must take direct aim at the economic and political inequality that breeds racism in order to create a truly multiracial, international, universalist community. We must reject race-based identity groups and diversity training that promotes racialized practices. Instead of ideologies of victimhood, such as white guilt tripping and Black paranoia, we must practice post-racial endeavors. So that completes my little presentation.
Thank you, Dick. We're now going to turn to Judith Bersanzi for her comments relating to the subject and Finley's book in particular. Okay, over to you, Judith.
Well, I think Dick did a really great job, as I knew he would, on summarizing the main argument of Finley's book and of Finley's thinking. So I'm not going to attempt to repeat that, but I'm going to focus on something a little different. I'm going to start with a few personal comments, as Dick did, and then I am going to talk a little bit about the process of editing, and then I'd like to try to look at the book, as Dick somewhat did also, in the context of more recent political events. So let me start by telling you that I didn't know Finley. I never met him in person, and the only times I interacted with him was very briefly during discussions we had following some of our Vesper services for the very short time when he was still with us and I had joined UMIAC. But in fact, the trajectories of our lives actually almost coincided, although they didn't quite. Finley became a member of the African American Studies Department of the University of Wisconsin in Madison just a year or two after I left UW-Madison, where I was a graduate student. And in fact, the very first year they started, I think at the time it was called the Black Studies Department, but at the very first year that department was started, I took their very first course in African American literature. And the reason I was involved in that department is that I was writing my dissertation on Langston Hughes, who I'm sure you are familiar with his poetry. I wasn't really in the field of Black studies. Well, there wasn't even the field of Black studies when I started on my dissertation. I was interested in proletarian literature. And the reason I had gone to Madison was to study with Dr. Walter Rideout, who had written the main book on that topic. And I think Finley and I also shared a very close political orientation, a very similar background in Marxism. But by the time Finley came to Madison, I had already left and I was out teaching. So we never actually met. And I would never have thought that years and years later, I would end up editing a book that he had written. So coincidences are, it's kind of interesting how life comes out. Well, in any case, I had a career teaching English and also doing editing on the side, not as a paid career, but for people I knew and helping them with their writing. And I very much like to do that. So when UMIAC put out a survey and said, well, what kind of skills does everyone have that they could contribute to our organization? I said, well, I could write and I could edit. And therefore, I was asked to help edit the book. Well, on to the editing. As Dick said, he was the primary editor of the book. And in fact, I have to tell you right now that I never read the manuscript that Finley wrote. Dick sent it to me. I looked at it. He had already written a complete version of the book to be finally released. And I could see that I didn't really need, and frankly, I didn't really want to go back to reading the entire book as it was. I figured I would just start with Dick's version. And actually, I think that worked out very well. Now, talking about editing in general, some writers do not like editors. They view editors as someone who's going to censor their views, who's going to try to distort them and shape them the way the editor wants. And they just don't like the whole idea. But I don't agree with that. And I think good writers realize that a good editor can really help you clarify in your own mind the ideas you want to present and help you put them in paper so that readers will be able to understand them. Good editors will sharpen up those ideas, they'll focus them, they'll really help the writer work through them. So that's what Dick and I tried to do. However, there was a difficulty, which is that Finley was not there because he had already passed on. So Dick was familiar with Finley as a person, and Dick was familiar with his work, but of course I wasn't. So I had the added difficulty that I had never known Finley. I never really talked to him. I certainly hadn't talked to him about his writing. So I didn't have any way to know what he would have done in certain situations. So it's very difficult, obviously, to edit a book when you can't interact with the writer. You just have to go by the text in front of you. That's what there is. You have to figure out what the writer wants to say, and you have to help him say it. In addition to the difficulty that Finley wasn't there and I didn't know Finley, there was also the problem that Finley was a kind of idiosyncratic writer. He used terminology which is not the sort of standard terminology that people would be using. And that was one thing Dick had already kind of cleaned up in his initial editing of the book. And that's really why I didn't go back and read the entire book as it was, because I thought it would be much easier to just start with what Dick had already done. So we had all those problems, but I want to deal with a couple of particular difficulties, or not difficulties, just situations that we had to deal with in editing. First of all, there's the question of the appendices. You probably noticed that there are a lot of appendices in the book. In fact, I'm not even sure what percentage of the book is actually these appendices. Some of them Finley wrote, some of them are the writings of other people. They're all kinds of different things. Well, they give a lot of extra supporting material, which is kind of what appendices do. And Dick and I had to make decisions about how much of that material to put in the book. Because I think we both felt that we didn't want to let the appendices take over the book. We didn't want it just to be a collection of writings. We wanted it to be Finley's writing. So we removed one or two of them where we thought the material was available elsewhere. We also cut down others a bit because, as I said, Finley, some of the appendices were essays by other people that Finley knew. Dick knew who some of those people were, but he didn't know who some of the others were, and we didn't have any way to contact them or find out who they were. So we weren't sure as to whether we wanted to put in this unknown writing in there. So we cut down those appendices a bit. And we tried at the same time to stick to Finley's idea that there would be the text and there would be the appendices. And I think Finley thought of writing in a way as a kind of collaborative enterprise, because he apparently wanted to put in things that people he knew had written, and he thought that they supplemented and enhanced the book very well. So we tried to stay with that intention, but still to keep the appendices a little bit under control. At least that was my thinking about what we were doing there. Well, the second problem or situation we ran into was having to do with audience. And the first thing you think about in a book is, well, what's the thesis? What's the argument? What's the point? And as either a writer or an editor, I think the next thing you have to think about is, who's the book written for? Who's going to read it? And in some ways, this was very clear in the book. And in the preface, what became the preface, it says very clearly, Finley says that he is writing for rank and file students, workers, and professionals who oppose racism. Well, that was fine. Okay. In other words, it's not a scholarly book. It's not written for specialists, and we certainly didn't want it to be that. The question is, was the book written for UUs? Was this book sort of inside the world of Unitarian Universalism? And in many ways, it seemed to be. And I think you might get the idea from Dick's presentation that that was the emphasis of the book. Well, again, I don't know what was in Finley's mind, but certainly there was a lot about the history of the UUA in the book. There was a long section in it narrating all the events, starting with Peter Morales's resignation that Dick has touched on, and going through the Todd Eckloff controversy. There was also a long appendix consisting of the plan for a workshop that was given at the First Unitarian Church of Chicago. There was another appendix stating the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, and there was also a section on the proposed 8th principle. Well, what to do with all this material? Would non-UU readers, and I think we both hoped that there would be some, how would they react to that? Would they be turned off by all that material and say, well, this is not a book that relates to me? And then there's also the question that specifically on the 8th principle. Okay, so the 8th principle project, and that 8th principle was adopted by a number of UUA congregations, although it was never officially adopted by the UUA. But let me see, where's my note here about the exact wording of that? Well, I can't find it right now. But should we include that? Because what happened at the GA in 2024, as I'm sure you remember, is that the 7 principles were abandoned. So an 8th principle was no longer talked about at all. I don't think it was mentioned at the GA at all, because we abandoned, well, the UUA abandoned these principles and instead put in these new values. So the 8th principle was, in a sense, a moot issue. Should we have the appendix or the section in the book that was devoted to the 8th principle? Well, if I'm remembering it right, Dick and I differed on that point. I thought it should go out. Dick thought it should stay in, and as you see, it stayed in. Because when you have 2 editors, they are going to compromise, and they are going to, each person is not going to get everything exactly the way he or she thinks it should be. And that's what the process of collaboration is. So when we presented the material on UUA, our idea was to present it as an example. This is an example of neo-racist thinking. It's an example of neo-racist practice. So the book is not really supposed to be directed at UUs. That's an example that everyone, whether they're UUs or not, can learn from, and it will help them understand the situation we face. So I think that was our goal in using that material. At least it was my goal, and I hope it turned out okay. Well, all right, let me bring all of this up to date with what's happened since. So first of all, thinking about the UUA, I guess I've already touched on this. It really hasn't been that long. Well, it's been a number of years since Finley wrote the book, and less time since we edited it, and not very long until we got it produced by Amazon. But there have been big changes in the UUA. Okay, so the first one was the 8th principle is gone, and the second one is that the 7 principles are gone, at least officially from the UUA. Let me see where I am here. Just when I kind of lost a little bit track of my thinking. Oh, okay. And these changes passed with a lot of opposition in June. The result of that is that some UUs left their congregations. Some congregations left the UUA. A new organization was formed. That's the North Atlantic Unitarian Association, which some of us are probably members of, or maybe our congregations are.
North America.
Membership generally in the UUA has declined. Donations to the UUA has declined, so financially their situation is not so good. Things are quite different. And I think the leadership, the current leadership of the UUA has had to step back on their program. They have postponed, for instance, rewriting Article 3 of the bylaws, which are very crucial because they deal with congregational autonomy. They have postponed dealing with that into the indefinite future. And given all those situations, how should UMIAC react to that? Do we really see ourselves then as talking primarily to UUs, talking primarily to UUs who are in the UUA, or do we see ourselves as doing something different? And I'm wondering whether Finley's book can perhaps offer us some guidance in discussing those topics, which I know we will be discussing. Okay, leaving Unitarian Universalism aside, as I'm looking generally at UU politics, things have changed a lot. Well, maybe they haven't really changed that much, but we now have the presidency of Donald Trump, or what I would call the co-presidency of Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And we have the dismantling of DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you will have read in Finley's book, Finley opposed at least some of these DEI initiatives, which he calls ruling class funded diversity training programs. And he presents them as examples of neo-racism that serve to divide the working class. And I agree with that. But we also have, but that doesn't mean that Finley agreed with Presidents Trump and Musk, because he was coming at this from a completely different direction in the interests of the working class, and that surely is not the way Trump and Musk are approaching that question. In fact, when I think about Trump and Musk, they are certainly racist, and their whole program is, to my mind, a racist program. And I don't even know if I would call it a neo-racist program. I kind of feel that they are old-style racists. In fact, they are denying, well, I don't know exactly, it's sort of the whole administration that's denying that racism even exists as a fact of American life. We're told that anyone who even speaks about people of color or who attempts to deal with issues like environmental pollution that might disproportionately affect people of color, anyone who does those things is actually being racist. Okay, and to insist that there are racial problems in American society is a racist thing to say. At the same time, Trump and Musk attacking all these other people as racist, they themselves continue to make remarks denigrating everyone other than white cisgender males as inferior, incompetent, and unworthy. In short, it seems as though we've returned to an era of open racism. And there seems to be, unfortunately, a lot of support among the population of the United States for that way of thinking. So I have a few questions. I'm wondering whether Finley was being overly optimistic when he says that we're now in a different era of racism, because maybe we have actually gone backwards. I'm also wondering how we can make clear that when we oppose DEI initiatives and when we talk against them, we're in no way supporting racist policies, and we're in no way supporting policies of the present administration. It would be good to have Finley still with us to advise us and guide us as we set out to do these things, but unfortunately that's not the case, so we have to figure it out. We have to figure out how to carry on his vision of multiracial unity while avoiding all these pitfalls that we now have in the current political situation. So that is my contribution, and I hope we'll have some good discussion.
Thank you, Judith. Okay, we now have a time for questions and answers. I'm thinking maybe about 10 minutes at this time. And I think that people like myself and Bobby, who are still to make our remarks, will probably withhold comment at this point because we'll have an opportunity to include them in our remarks. But I would like for people to raise a hand if you would like to make a comment, ask a question, clarification, whatever else you might describe your statement as. And if you could use the raise hand feature, in your controls on Zoom, you have a raise hand feature at the bottom, and that will make it clear that you are trying to get our attention. I will call on you that way. If for some reason you're on a phone and can't figure out your controls there to raise your hand, you can obviously, turn on your video if it's off and physically raise your hand and can call on you in that way. So without further ado, I'm looking for people who would like to make a remark in response to our editor's presentations. Okay, well, we're going to start with Eric. So you're up first.
Beautifully done, guys. Yeah, wow, Dick, that was a moving testimony to Finley. I knew him for a year, and that was just beautiful stuff. I appreciate that.
Okay, that's the extent of your comment. Okay, Barbara Jean.
Hi, I'm sorry for being late. I got my time slots confused. I'm curious about what Finley's intent was in turning the document over to UMIAC. So does UMIAC now own the rights to the document, or does that still belong to the Campbell estate?
Well, we published it saying copyright the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council. But any income from it goes to UMIAC.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm just, do you know what his intent though was? I mean, quite a bit of editing took place to the point that I think I don't hear Finley's voice when I read it. And I know, having been an editor for a long time myself, it's a tricky thing to clean up somebody else's writing, and sometimes we lose some of the more I don't say signifying words and mannerisms.
Yeah, there was no mention, for example, of white supremacyology. Yeah.
You know, that was one of the words that I changed because I thought it would, turn off the audience, the current audience, because it's one of those peculiarities. And I realized that white supremacy culture was a much more current term, although that may be getting a little bit dated too, because the new UUA president does not use that term like the previous one did. So things do change kind of rapidly here, sometimes in terminology and issues, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have always worked with authors who we had a lot of back and forth about why did you change this and what did you do? So I can see that you really were at a disadvantage in trying to figure out what he might have said or could have said. In the process of writing or editing, did the two of you include additional material of your own?
There were a couple places where I added a paragraph or two where actually I sent, I specified in the book an editor's note or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that happened a couple of times. Like I remember at one point I added some information on from a survey on the percentage of Americans who are racist or mildly racist or strongly racist. A few notes like that. But mostly what happened was that it was so, I guess the word sprawling has been used with lots of repetition in between some of the appendices and some of the text and whatnot, that in places I could just keep Finley's wording, but there are places to condense it into something more readable and coherent. I had to use more of my own voice because even though I could understand and recognize Finley's voice, I couldn't reproduce it. You see, so there are places where it's more like my voice because that's where I combine maybe several paragraphs here and several paragraphs there and put something into more coherent uh, uh, presentation. But that's where I tried to capture the essence of what Finley was talking about, and from the point of view of someone who's maybe a little more current on some of these things in terms of making it more marketable to, because we could have done it just as a purely historical document. This is what Finley did, but it probably would have be viewed as more of an historical document and not something of current interest in that case. So at least I made the decision that I wanted to make it more current, as Judith said, something that would be where you use the UUA incidents would be an example, and we'll be using terminology that more people could currently relate to. But in regard to one of the things she said is, I don't feel that Trump and Musk, even though they're racist, I don't feel that they are reflecting a resurgence of racism in U.S. society. There's always been some latent racism. I think they're trying to magnify it, but also I think they are deliberately taking advantage of the reaction, the backlash against this neo-racism that Finley's talking about, all the cancel culture and things like that. So I think it's more opportunistic in many ways. They're exploiting when that neo-racism got out of academia and the UUA into the larger society, it created a backlash, and they are exploiting that like any good politically opportunistic politician would. And that's what I think Trump is. I think he's not an ideologue. I think it's an opportunist, and he and Musk are exploiting that. And that's one reason I think this new racism is still very, very current, because I view it as a causal cause and effect as to what's going on right now. You see.
Thank you.
I agree. Can I just comment a little bit on that? I agree with all that Dick has said. Although with Trump, I think it's in a sense, it's meaningless to say Does he really believe that? Is he being or is he being opportunistic? It doesn't really make much difference, does it? Because
Right.
it comes out the same one way or the other. And originally coming from New York myself, I can remember when Trump took out full-page ads in the New York Times attacking the young men of color who were arrested in the assault on a jogger in Central Park and calling for them all to be executed.
Yes.
Did he do that just because he thought that would be a popular thing to do? Well, of course, in New York City, it wasn't that popular thing to do. Or did he really think so? By the way, one of those young men is now on the New York City Council and the other one's running for the council. So fortunately, Trump didn't get his way. Regarding adding material, Dick is correct. We did add some material and we always labeled it note from the editors when we put it in so that the right readers would be able to tell the different voices.
Quite an undertaking.
Okay, I'm going to go next to Ken Christensen, and this will be the last question for this period before we go to the second half of our program. Okay,
Yeah,
Ken?
I can say this now or later, but I'll say it now. To me, Finley was a life force. Basically, hard to pin down. Even when you're with him, on a given subject, he would be all there. He was an organizer par excellence. When things were falling apart in UUA, he's the one who called Todd Eckloff and said, when Todd Eckloff was really in kind of bad shape, and said, let's get together. And then the next convocation we had featured Todd Eckloff and other people who were involved. And he was so good at seeing people, identifying them. He took me out to lunch. I basically, background in the United Church of Christ, still have links there, but not doing much there. 2009, we moved to Chicago. 2008, we moved to Chicago, and my wife went to Meadville Seminary, and I did other things. But we joined First Unitarian Church, and Finley sought me out, took me out to lunch, talked about what he was doing, listened to me. And I became involved. I was there when we named UMIAC, the first as a caucus, and later, of course, it became a council. But I just see him as a life force, and I was aware of his writings along the way. One time, we had a 4-page mountaintop newsletter, and then he sent me the blank for the next one, and it was more like 30 pages. And I right then, that day, I didn't have time to help, and I was going to help again the day after, or a couple of days later, but he got with somebody else and did an edition. But he could put things together really from inside in many directions all at once, and that's kind of hard to put into a book.
Okay, thank you, Ken. So I'm going to move us now to the second part of our convocation here. And this time you'll be hearing from two individuals, myself and then Bobby Campbell, who knew Finley for decades. And so we are bringing, a breadth of interactions with him and so forth that's much broader than just the book on neo-racism. So I'll start with myself. I first, just kind of by chance, both I and Finley Campbell joined First Unitarian Church in Chicago in 1992. And starting in the late 90s and then throughout certainly the first decade of this century, actually spilling into the second decade, he would organize a class called The Nature of Racism, which was really about not only racism through historically, but also about its transition to neo-racism, and covered both things. So he would offer this course, but each year he would tend to present again, but with a different, maybe orientation, particularly with how did neo-racism affect women, or how did it affect immigrants and so forth. So there would be, things of this nature. There would be these various variances. So he would be presenting, and then there would be discussions after each session, so we could get better understanding and, help clarify each other's minds and so forth. So that's part of what I bring here. Now, most of my presentation, I'm going to be talking about different segments in the book and little commentary, if I may disagree with them to some extent or whatever. But just for the overall structure, I'm going to call it a power structure because it had both a economic elite, which were basically wealthy individuals, mainly capitalists, and the structure of racism originally and then neo-racism was designed to kind of support and protect their power and their wealth, and particularly protect it from forces that might be considered populist, left-wing populist, democratic socialist, other things like this that might threaten to bring down that wealth and its power. And so you have an economic elite, and then you have a much larger proportion of the population, which is basically part of a structure to maintain that status quo or that protection of the wealthy elites. And this includes people who are professionals, people who are in managerial positions, a variety of other descriptions you might have out there. And these are people who are in education, they're in media, they're in various cultural areas, they're in government at all levels. It's a structure that helps kind of, keep the society going in a way that, again, protects that economic elites and their power and their wealth. And so under traditional racism, again, you wanted to divide, if you want to call it the masses, the people who might have economic interests that was counter to that economic elite from getting together. And racism was used, traditional racism, to do that. And then with the end of traditional racism, because of the success of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, you had to come up with something else. And so neo-racism is what replaced that. And originally it was replacing a strict racial structure with a new structure that had a lot of racial components, but it was really looking at intelligence, education, culture, these other markers as to who would be part of the structure of maintaining, American structure in a way that would protect the economic elites. And then so it was now a time where people who were Black or other non-white components could come into that structure, be part of that structure. But to kind of balance things off, initially, we're going to, it's not going to be strictly racial. We're going to cast out a lot of the white folks who were traditionally poor, who were, quote, white trash or whatever. So they're no longer part of the, the in crowd, if you want to call it that, of society, the power structure. So you came up with this intellectual structure for this new way of having a structure that was often had a lot of, appeared kind of racist in many ways, but it was not strictly along racial lines. So this is what might be called neo-racism 1.0, was coming up in the 70s and 80s. But then there was what became what Finley and I often discuss, what became almost like 2.0 for neo-racism, which was this movement to use blaming and shaming and a lot of the identity politics that started in the 90s and grew in this century. And so that was a second phase to this. So on page 11 of the book, there was I'm going to quote it, it says, more recent and expanding components of neo-racism included, one, the recruitment of Black elites into the ruling class, along with the new ideology of race that they created. So I guess my commentary based on what I've just said is, it wasn't just the recent decades. It was back at the beginning of neo-racism, back in the 70s and even the very end of the 60s, where you were getting an opening of the door for Blacks and other non-whites to be part of the power structure of the country. Now, later on, it says, there's a second paragraph that reads, it says, quote, the rapid spread of anti-white language and doctrine. And this is where we're talking about neo-racism 2.0. So those two things, 1 and 2, one really began at the beginning of neo-racism, but the second one is really part of this neo-racism 2.0. So then on page 18, there's a at the end of paragraph 2, it says the traditional racism was opposing interracial sexuality between working class individuals. But I want to make note of the fact that this did not block intersexual relationships if it was between like a master and a slave, as that was not seen as a threat to the power structure, whereas intersexual relationships between the non-power structure people would be a threat. On page 19 of the book, it says, I want to comment that unfortunately in recent years, the progressive left's focused on benefiting various identities rather than things that will help all people, kind of universal values, has provided economic elites with another way to divide people or divide the masses in order to protect their interests. On page 24, in the second paragraph, it says white was kind of like a synonym for English back in the early years of this country. I would have to say that white was more of an equivalent to European rather than just English for even in the early parts of our country, that you did have people who were Dutch and German and French and so forth in the colonies, and they were part of that white structure. On page 25, there's reference to a phase 2 of the post-Civil War segregationist movement. And it says this goes from 1896 to 1945. Well, we know 1896 is the legal beginning of Jim Crow based on the Supreme Court decision of separate but equal being approved. Anyway, it goes on to say that what I think it should say is not only that this was a supremacy of Jim Crow segregation during that period in the South, but also it was a period of de facto segregation in the rest of the United States. Plus, you also had the rise of racist fascist movements in Germany, Italy, and Japan. And I kind of disagree with the comment in this page there where it says it made reference to the American racism being defeated by the New Deal. I disagree with that. I think it was really defeated by the new civil rights movement in the post-World War II era going up through the 60s. On page 27, the second paragraph, there's a implication that people of color are exploited more when well-paid manufacturing jobs were offshored. I think that all workers whose jobs were offshored suffered. I don't see the data to support that people of color were disproportionately impacted. I think that it impacted all people. I don't know exact numbers, but I think it was, it was a multiracial adverse effect. On page 45, there's a use of the phrase trans-white oligarchy. And as I don't think that the people who were non-white, who were becoming part of the economic elite or the power structure of the country, really consider themselves to be somehow transitioning into being white. I don't think that would be a good term, because I don't think that they identify themselves as having transitioned to being white. So I think that label is not a good choice of words. On page 56, it says that UUMUAC was denied a booth at the exhibition hall at the 2022 General Assembly. I want to correct the record. It was originally denied a booth at the 2020 General Assembly. We were approved for a booth. Then about 3 days before the General Assembly, it was withdrawn from and shut down. And then subsequent to that, we didn't apply as an organization for a booth in 2021 because we figured we were going to be denied again. But then in 2022, the GA organizers actually reached out to us along with others to ask us to apply for having a booth. So we took them up on their offer and applied for another booth in 2022. But then a couple of months later on, there were people hiring the oligarchy or bureaucracy of the UA who overrode the decisions of the GA organizers to again yank that exhibition booth from UUMUAC. Let's see. Okay, and then there's going to go down to the appendix on neoliberal globalization, and this is on a couple comments on pages 105 and 106. There's a discussion in the last full paragraph of 105 that shows kind of a lack of understanding of the Federal Reserve and that of its joint mandate to both try to control inflation and keep unemployment relatively low. And that the fact that the Fed sometimes has to focus more on one or the other, fighting inflation or fighting unemployment. And, depending on what it considers a more serious problem at that time in history or point in time, whatever you want to call it. And on the next page, it says, quote, the unemployment rate was chosen as the primary means of controlling inflation. I just want to state clearly that the Fed does not have a direct control over the unemployment rate. What it has a control over is the short-term interest rates, going up or down. And when in fighting inflation, they may raise the short-term interest rates. This often has the impact or intent of slowing the economy. That often does have some adverse effect on employment, but it's not a direct control. And there's a number of factors that play into how the unemployment rate actually goes. It's not just based on some kind of total federal control. So that kind of sums up my comments where I thought, there was some lack of clarity or not the best use of words in some parts of the book. But overall, I certainly, applaud the book and its effort to try to educate people about racism. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bobby.
All right, there's no way I can say all the things I have to say here. I will try to finish up in 10 minutes so that we will have some time to discuss it. Some of you know that I requested the co-authors or the co-editors to sign on as co-authors, and they did not want to do that. I can understand why Judith did. I still wish that Dick had done it. I was allowed to instead put in a postscript to the later printings of the book, talking about trying to emphasize what I thought were Finley's main points, because I am concerned that in some of the editing, some of the concepts have been modified into concepts that were not Finley's. So I, of course, base a lot of what I'm saying on 50 years actually of struggling politically with him. I knew him before we got married, but I also have the original document that I have gone through and compared the writings with. So I will talk about some of those. I have a 4-page essay about this. If you want it, you can certainly email me and I will send it to you. So I am dismayed that some of these ideas that I see as not Finley's ideas have been published only in his name. And for the public record, then he becomes the voice of these things. So the major things are these, and Alan has hit on a couple of them, I think. The first is, who is hurt by neo-racism? And I would like to say that throughout his life and throughout his political life, Finley has argued that Blacks are the main targets of racism. He knew that the oppression of the working class started with capitalism, that racism then developed. And in the US, that racism has targeted Black workers, remains to target Black workers. He emphasized often the way in which racism also hurts white workers. And the reason he emphasized that so much is because it was talked about so little, that he had to talk about it often to make people understand it. But he never said that white workers were hurt more by racism than Black workers were. He also understood pretty clearly the dialectical relationship between race and class. And so the question that comes up repeatedly throughout the book is, what is more important, race or class? And the answer to that is they interact over time. He has a very powerful statement that is in the original document. Reads this way. Yet in the midst of this complex racial situation, one essential truth breaks forth for us like a fiery torch, and that is the class nature of racism and the racist nature of class oppression. I'm sorry, this light in this classroom goes out, and I have to get up and wave it to make it come back on again. In the editing, however, a qualifier is put in there. And the editing on page 88, you will read, and the racist nature of class oppression, the subtle, in my opinion, unnecessary qualifier, it becomes, that is the class nature of racism as well as the often racist nature of class oppression. So the attempts to reword things so that you think they read better has produced a couple of really unfortunate changes. In his, and I'm going to read you something from page 70, but first I'll read you what he wrote in the original document. In the original document, he writes, and in multiculturalist diversity-based corporations and academic institutions, a well-qualified African-American female is now preferred over an unqualified white male or even a qualified white male. You'll read on page 70, and in diversity-based corporations and academic institutions, a modestly qualified African-American female is typically preferred over a better qualified white, Asian, or Jewish male. Now that becomes a very different statement, and I am very upset that it is out there under Finley's name. He regarded Jewishness as a religion, by the way, not as a race. And there's a little more subtle example. Finley wrote that the Julius Wilson School of Black Sociology will talk about Black teenage pregnancy being on the increase without referencing the elimination of abortion clinics for the poor or the restrictions in public schools of Planned Parenthood information. In the book on page 31, it says, in some areas, the single mother problem has been compounded by limited access to abortion and family planning services. This refers now to a much larger group of Black women, not just Black students, and invokes, at least in my mind, the familiar emphasis that Black women are having too many children. Well, there are a lot of other things. You may have eliminated the word white supremacyology, but you introduced a set of words he never used: neoliberal globalization. Now, there is an appendix supposedly defining neoliberal globalization, but it's based on an appendix in his book defining neoliberal. And in the original document, most of that is in italics because he indicates that the wording is from the web, not his wording. And in the definition of neoliberal globalization in the book, it reads like it's Finley's definition. Well, let me just say a couple of other things, or one other thing, because you talked about Finley being canceled by the UUA based on the denial of this table at GA. Finley was canceled in much broader ways by the UUA. For a long time, we couldn't figure out how it was that so many requests that he sent in to GA about programs and things would be totally ignored. We found out later, and I'm going to use names here. We found out it was actually at a meeting with our new minister, a meeting of the former presidents of the congregation. A former president of the First Unitarian Congregation told how Rob Eller Isaacs, an important person in the UUMA, had approached congregants at First U about Finley, saying, how could you allow such a person to be a member of your congregation? Well, I can only imagine that that same conversation took place throughout the UUA. He never used the word cancel culture, but I think it certainly describes what happened to him. So he also never used the word woke. He never used woke craft. He never used virtue signaling. But I suspect the rewriting of the text has taken place with the best of intentions, but I am upset about some of the things that are now published under his name. So I'll stop there. You're muted, Alan.
Thank you, Bobby. So at this point, we will have another opportunity for about 10 minutes, 12 minutes or so to raise questions, comments, clarifications, or whatever regarding the presentations by either myself or Bobby. So I'm going to turn to Richard first. He's got his hand up. And again, if you want to speak, please use the raise hand feature that you usually will find at the bottom of your screen. And if for some reason that doesn't work for you, maybe you're on a phone or something, then you may physically raise a hand to indicate you should like to speak. Okay, Richard.
I want to defend the term trans racial oligarchy.
Okay,
It's true that the word trans has a new connotation because of all the transgender people, and it has this connotation of changing one thing into another.
yeah, the word was trans white.
But okay, trans white. It has an older meaning, though. We talk about the Trans-Canada Highway. It's just a highway that crosses a lot of categories. And so trans white in that sense, it's an implication that there's something that's crossing a lot of different categories. And in that older sense, I understood the term perfectly well when I encountered it, but enough. I mean, I don't have any more to say.
Okay. Okay, Dick, you're next.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the same thing, that trans white oligarchy would, to my reading, was meaning the same as a multiracial oligarchy. That's the classical meaning of it, not anything newer. Also, it was in editing the book, it was difficult because sometimes Finley would say things that I thought were outright wrong or I disagreed with very strongly, and sometimes I left Ellen found some of those things that I simply disagreed with, but left in there, just to be sure more representative of Finley. But like on the claim that racism and classism are identical, basically, I very strongly disagreed with that. And I couldn't quite live with that, actually.
Okay. That's it for you. Okay. Do
Can
we
I
have any?
respond to that?
Sure, Bobby.
I'm not trying to say they're the same thing, but they interact with each other. They're always interacting.
Yeah, but the quote from Finley was extreme there, and I couldn't live with that quote that you did from Finley, that original quote. He didn't, and that's the problem. Sometimes when Finley said something, it was kind of sometimes it was right on, but sometimes he hadn't really considered the larger context, or he just focused on one thing, and it could be, I thought, wasn't appropriate.
That's why you should be a co-author, Dick.
Well, no, it's just that because he would have reconsidered some of that language on publication after discussing with others. I'm quite confident of that.
Disagree.
Sometimes you put something together and you think, and you later think, well, I shouldn't have said it that way. And you can see in the other parts of Finley's writing that he didn't agree with that extreme language on racism and classism being almost identical or whatever.
Okay, you have difference of opinions.
Right.
Okay, and you're entitled to both have that opinion. But obviously the editors had to do their best as they could solve would best serve the needs of the reader. Okay, Ken.
Just a minute, let me switch my thing here. Okay. I'd like to just briefly, I'm going to put 2 links in the chat room. This book by William Barber, Finley would, I think, totally agree with. Barber makes the case that not talking about white poverty and how the whites are hurt in society has hurt all over, has really changed the political picture, and we need to include white poverty, all people's poverty, in effect, in what we discuss. And I remember when I first attended one session, I was only allowed to attend one unless I joined, of the Beloved Conversations class at the church I used to belong to here in town. The first thing the leader said, who was a UU minister, by the way, first thing she said was, "We're not going to consider white people's problems here." and Barber is saying that's a big mistake. By the way, I sent a copy of this book to that person recently.
Good for you.
And the second book, I guess I have it on I only have it in Kindle. The second book, this whole question of the nebulousness of white supremacy culture, or what the hell's going on, is really big. And there have been several books that for me have helped explain what's going on. And one of them is John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I read his first edition in about 2005 and then shared that with a lot of people, including some students when I was still teaching then. But at that point, he was talking about how the U.S. was going to nations around the world and convincing them that if they want to become like the U.S., they have to take out big loans, and they really built on fear and anxiety about things and debt and other things, and they really changed a lot of countries, and it was all outside the United States at that time. In his third edition, I'm going to post the link here. I'm about 4/5 of the way through it. I'm not quite all the way through it. In his third edition, he really gets to the current, it's 2023 published. He really gets to how that has entered the US now. And it is an explanation par excellence of the wealth supremacy culture. Actually, he calls it a corporatocracy. They rule by corporations. And I think, gee whiz, I think everybody would appreciate it. The third edition summarizes what was in the earlier editions. To get more detail, you'd have to go back to them. But he pretty much covers the topics we covered in the early edition. In the middle part, he first introduces some stuff that's new, and then deals with how China is becoming involved in this and how other countries are relating. He has a more of a global perspective on how the economic world and corporate culture, corporatocracy, wealth supremacy culture, whatever you want to call it, how it's shaped. And I got the link there.
Okay, thank you, Ken. And I do want to build on that by mentioning that the UUMUAC has a multiracial unity book club. And the book that Ken just spoke about, White Poverty by Barber, is the choice for our next book that we're going to be reading and discussing. So if any of you who are not currently part of our list for that book club would like to join the book club, you're certainly welcome to do so. And I serve as a facilitator for that body, and so you can send me an email either to uumuac@gmail.com or to my personal email, which many of you know. So however you communicate, if you would like to be added to the list for our book club, let me know, because that will be the next book we'll be reading and discussing. Anyone else? Okay.
Well, I could say one more thing on the use of the term neoliberal globalization. It's sort of like when I looked at Finley's book, I wanted to make it a little more accessible to what's going on right now. So like instead of the white supremacology, I said, well, white supremacy culture is sort of the current term for pretty much the same thing. And that people would connect a lot more to that, especially UUs would connect to it. The same is true of neoliberal globalization. Finley had a very global point of view, more than most people in UMIAC. In fact, he had a very global point of view. He used terms like late stage capitalism. But among the larger public these days, the word, you could have said like neoliberal capitalism or free market capitalism. I thought the word neoliberal globalization really captures Finley's spirit in modern terms, because he had the global focus, he had the focus on capitalism and this late stage capitalism he talked about. Sometimes he also called it, finance, kind of industrial or merchant capitalism. And so I used the term there that was much more current, basically described what Finley's focus was in current terminology.
Okay. Do you have any more comments? Okay. Well, I think we're going to draw the convocation